How's it going, everybody? So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the two primary causes of most diseases, okay? And now when I'm talking about diseases, I'm strictly talking about chronic diseases such as diabetes, obesity, we can call it a chronic disease, heart disease, and cancer, stuff like that. I am not talking about autoimmune diseases. I'm not talking about digestive disorders, because those are actually short-term illnesses and conditions that are really not that hard to reverse at all. And I will be speaking more on that in different videos. I've already made a variety of different videos on that topic. Those are typically caused by food intolerances. And most people don't actually follow a strategic elimination diet. Or they don't feel like food intolerances can cause these things. Things like multiple sclerosis, obviously irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, fibromyalgia, psoriasis. These are actually caused by eating foods that essentially your body is intolerant to. And typically elimination diets can solve those things. But what I'm talking about in this video are the two main factors that drive heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and things like that. So, number one is going to be high glycemic load carbohydrates. Now, we all know about the glycemic index. What a lot of people don't know is that the glycemic index is, so the glycemic index is basically just how quickly a food drives up your blood sugar and how fast the blood or the sugar is shuttled into the bloodstream. Glycemic load actually takes into account the amount, like the concentration of carbohydrates or the concentration of glucose in each food, along with how fast it is shuttled into the bloodstream. And so instead of focusing on glycemic index, you need to be focusing on glycemic load, and particularly high glycemic load carbohydrates like white grain products, and grain products in general, and white sugar, processed carbohydrates typically are what drives that. A side tangent is the nutrient density and the concentration of anti-nutrients, but that is less important than the glycemic index. Typically, people eat properly prepared foods, properly prepared grains and things of this nature that are low glycemic load, and they stick to low glycemic load fruits and vegetables. They're not going to experience insulin resistance, and in fact, there are many studies that show putting diabetes into remission from low glycemic load carbohydrate diets. And just eliminating high glycemic load carbohydrates will balance out insulin and remove the side effects of high blood sugar and chronically elevated insulin levels. Now, you can achieve this through simply removing high glycemic load carbohydrates and replacing it with low glycemic load carbohydrates like broccoli, carrots, even something like a sweet potato, and oranges, lemons, grapefruits. Or you can just go keto and drastically decrease your carbohydrate intake below 20 grams per day in general. And obviously that's going to have a profound effect on your glycemic response, your insulin levels. It's going to lower your triglycerides, and the whole shebang. Now, that is probably the primary thing, and that's going to drastically affect your short-term health. You'll notice benefits within the first 2 to 6 weeks. Your triglycerides will go down, your HDL profile will be better, HDL to triglycerides. Your LDL will probably improve. That's going to depend more on how many fats you're going to be consuming and the ratio of different types of fatty acids. But you're going to be a lot healthier. And you'll see that in the short term. Whereas in the long term, the more important factors include obviously the glycemic load of your diet is going to impact both short-term and long-term health and your heart disease risk and cancer, because heart disease and cancer tend to develop over the long term. But omega-3 EPA and DHA, in comparison to arachidonic acid and omega-6. So the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is something that is rather confusing. It's something that's very complicated, and most people have a very basic understanding of it that's not quite complete. Now, on average, it probably is a wise idea to consume a omega-3 to omega-6 ratio that is similar to that of hunter-gatherer ancestors. That can range from anything from a 4-to-1 ratio to a 1-to-4 ratio. The Inuits tended to get a higher concentration of omega-3s compared to omega-6, whereas, because they're eating more fish and sea animals, whereas the hunter-gatherers that were subsisting on mostly land animals and mammals like buffalo, or even mammoths and things, they tended to get more omega-6 compared to omega-3. The thing is, they did not get anything higher than a 1-to-6 ratio, 1-to-4 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So so that's the first thing about the ratio. Now the thing is, the studies done on omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in our modern times, on our modern diet, with our modern technology, and relationship to disease were primarily animal studies, okay? They found that the animals tested needed a specific ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. Now, this doesn't take into account the DHA to EPA ratio within those omega-3s, which also plays a big part, and also what fatty acids are comprising of those omega-6. So the evidence and the studies in regards to that is very complex, and it's not complete. However, mechanistically, we know that a high amount of EPA, in particular, found usually in like abnormally isolated supplements, higher EPA tends to have an anti-inflammatory effect that is very similar to aspirin. Now the thing is, the way that EPA works, high concentration EPA, tends to have the same side effects as aspirin, and this has to do with how it uses arachidonic acid and then how it affects the ratios of arachidonic acid, EPA, and DHA. Now in particular, the human organism, the majority of our cell membranes are comprised of DHA, omega-3, and to a lesser extent EPA. So what is vitally important is to obtain enough DHA from your diet, and obviously with that is going to come a balanced ratio of EPA depending on the source. If it's supplements, that's going to possibly put you at an increased risk for other diseases. That might explain why supplemental fish oil in some studies have shown increase in heart disease and mortality. If you get your omega-3s from algae oil, if you are a vegan, and then flax-fed egg yolks or pasture-raised egg yolks where the chickens are eating insects and natural grasses and getting enough sunlight, you get your DHA from ruminant animals, because typically pasture-raised or grass-fed ruminant animals like bison or lamb or beef, or even elk and deer, they're going to have a higher DHA content. Okay, the majority of their omega-3s are going to be from DHA. Fish, on the other hand, have higher amounts of EPA, and the primary source of EPA in the diet is going to be from fish. Now, liver is going to give you a certain amount of DHA, and particularly grass-fed, and fish will give you a decent amount of both. Okay, so how do we use all of this information in a practical sense? Okay, so first of all, making sure that you do get enough arachidonic acid in your diet, despite the fact that, there's a lot of health experts that believe arachidonic acid is harmful. The fact is, if you get arachidonic acid in too high of levels, especially compared to your DHA and EPA, that can be potentially harmful. And typically, as long as you're consuming high quality animal sources, grass-fed animals, pasture-raised animals, or you're just taking a supplement that has higher levels of EPA and DHA, typically you're going to be fine. If you really want to know how much arachidonic acid compared to EPA and DHA you're getting, the best way to do this is not necessarily by chronometer. That's not entirely accurate, but by measuring your tissue levels of DHA to EPA to arachidonic acid through blood testing, and that's going to be more complex, and that can range you anywhere from $80 to $200 for a simple test of that nature. Now, the easiest way to achieve this would be to stick to grass-fed animals, consume a higher proportion of your protein from flax-fed egg yolks in particular, and fish, and don't be afraid of consuming brains. Don't be afraid of consuming liver, especially calf liver. Calf liver compared to beef liver. I prefer calf liver. I think it's better for you. I think that's very important. And here's the thing. This is vitally important for your long-term cardiovascular risk, and in particular, the soft plaques in your arteries. I believe calcified plaques have more to do with calcium metabolism, vitamin K2, vitamin D3, and most likely the glycemic load of your diet. And this is probably why people like Shawn Baker and these other carnivore dieters that eat mostly grain-fed meat or whatever tend to have a low calcium artery calcium scan or coronary artery calcium scan, is because of the glycemic load of their diet, and they're probably getting adequate amounts of vitamin K2 for whatever reason. Typically, people with a higher glycemic load diet tend to have more calcium artery calcification. And even with grain-fed diets, you might be able to escape this heart disease risk and cancer risk because the omega-6 levels in your diet are very, very low. So here's the thing: is omega-6 and trans fats tend to deplete. Actually, they tend to compete for the same enzyme that is used to convert and process. You could think the same enzyme that's used to metabolize the EPA, DHA, and DHA. And so that's the main reason why higher omega-6 is bad. Okay, so it's not necessarily the ratio that matters. It is the concentration, the total concentration of EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid in your body. And so it's if you're consuming low omega-6 and you're getting a decent proportion of EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid, not excessive amounts of any one in particular, but in adequate amounts, the low omega-6 load of your diet is going to effectively help your body to provide a balance and adequate amounts of EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid. And this is going to be the most beneficial preventative measure for epigenetic factors for preventing arthrosclerosis, strokes. There's some other factors involved, and cancer. And cancer as well can have other factors, but dietary, like when we're talking about the nutrition's effect, the concentration of EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid in comparison to omega-6 and these hydrogenated oils in particular, and then the low glycemic load of your diet, this is what matters. So yes, there are people that have followed a ketogenic diet who have had heart issues, and this is probably because of the higher amounts of total fatty acids they are consuming. It basically increases the likelihood of an imbalance because they're consuming more fatty acids. And so they could be consuming too much arachidonic acid compared to the others, or not enough DHA and too much EPA, which can, in the short term, increase your anti-inflammatory effects of your body and lower inflammation, but over time, just like with aspirin, can actually cause an imbalance in these fatty acids, which can result in arteriosclerosis and inflammatory conditions. That can also be seen in long-term cortisone and corticosteroid pharmaceutical drugs. They can result in the same thing. Sorry, but the side effects are very similar to a high EPA load. Now, there are many benefits to higher EPA consumption. Your best bet is going to be consuming a variety of wild-caught fish, grass-fed animals, and flax-fed or pasture-raised eggs. I like flax-fed eggs that are humanely certified, non-GMO certified, in particular because the source that I've gotten, the shells are harder, which indicates a healthier nutrient composition, harder than the organic pasture-raised eggs that I've gotten. And the yolks are golder, and they just seem more nourishing, and I feel better when I eat them. Flax-fed eggs are guaranteed to contain a high amount of omega-3 year-round, whereas pasture-raised or grass-fed, eggs or whatever, these chickens could have varying levels of omega-3. So flax-fed eggs guarantees higher concentration of omega-3s compared to omega-6. And don't rely on just getting grass-fed ruminant animals, because they do have high amounts of, a decent amount of DHA, but the amount of omega-3s in grass-fed meats are nothing in comparison to fish. Okay, and if you really want to decrease the negative effects of omega-6, because they compete for the same enzyme, just increase your dietary consumption of EPA and DHA, because then the omega-6 matters less. The entire reason why omega-6 have been found to be inflammatory in feeding studies with humans in hospitals from like the 50s or the 60s is simply because higher omega-6 actually lowers the tissue levels of omega-3, EPA and DHA, by competing for that same enzyme used to metabolize those two fatty acids. And so just providing your body with good DHA and EPA, it kind of neutralizes the effects. It's kind of like when you consume enough, when you consume L-DOPA, right? You're skipping an enzymatic step of the conversion of phenylalanine to tyrosine to L-DOPA to dopamine. So your body can synthesize more of the active thing that it needs without all of these complicated steps that can be interfered with by omega-6. Hopefully this all made sense. The point is lower your glycemic load no matter what diet you follow. Eat more EPA, DHA, and DHA omega-3s. And, avoid those omega-6s, Avoid the hydrogenated oils, which deplete the body of EPA and DHA as well. And then on top of that, also it might be worth looking into Barry Sears' work, which I didn't get this from at all because he talks down on arachidonic acid, and his research was done like in the 80s or whatever. But essentially, he has a very good understanding of lipid metabolism besides saturated fat, and the cholesterol and what HDL and LDL are. And essentially, he was on to a similar path, but his work was incomplete. And modern studies, which is where all of my information comes from, paints a more complete picture. But in particular, omega-9 GLA, which you might be able to find in olive oil, and this might actually be why the Mediterranean diet has works wonders. All of the blue zones, actually, they typically consume they have some kind of source of GLA in their diet, which tends to have an anti-inflammatory effect on its own, and they do consume a higher amount of DHA and EPA in their diet. Okay, and I think the fatty acids and the sources of energy in your diet are more important than the polyphenols in these things. And I think that is particularly what's protective over all the centenarians in the world, is that they have, consumed a source of egg yolk every day, like that one woman who consumed like 3 raw eggs a day, particularly the egg yolk. Liver has a decent source of DHA. Fish, these are all common patterns in most centenarians. The glycemic load of their diet is typically very low, and also the GLA, okay, the essential omega-9. Now, the last thing you want to do, never do this, never consume like an essential fatty acid supplement that contains omega-6 and omega-9. Never. If you need omega-9 and omega-6, get it from olive oil and get it from your diet, not from oil, from oils other than olive. Omega-3, maybe in the short term, if you've been eating wrong for a long time, consuming a high potency cod liver oil, maybe salmon oil, maybe krill oil. But I think cod liver oil is good in small amounts for approximately 2 to 4 months, and it's a good source of vitamin D as well. After that point, dramatically lower the dosage so you're not overdosing on EPA or anything like that, and get most of it from your diet, okay? So my recent research in the last couple months on long-term cardiovascular health and cancer, I found a pretty good reason to consume grass-fed meats, to consume wild-caught fish, and really be concerned with your DHA intake. The thing is, the ratio isn't really much difference between grain-fed and grass-fed. There's not really a lot of omega-3 compared to omega-6. There's just as much omega-6 in grass-fed compared to grain-fed. The difference is the specific types of fatty acids inside of grass-fed fats compared to grain-fed. Is that palmitic acid, stearic acid, arachidonic acid, and DHA, and these things are drastically different. And this will have a drastic impact over the long term, because it takes quite some time for the human's fatty acid tissues, like the actual inside of your cell, like inside of your cells and inside of your body, to change. It can take up to 2 years at first to change 15 to 25% of your body's fatty acids in the tissues, composition of fatty acids in the tissues. So trying to get all this information out in a short amount of time, but the video is going to be about 25 minutes, so whatever. Also, it might be a good idea to supplement with vitamin C or consume a adequate source of vitamin C. Make sure you get enough B1 and folate if you're following a low-carb diet. Just because I'm starting to feel like there are a lot of falsehoods in the carnivore community, and the keto community should be aware of this as well, because there are actually people who have suffered from certain elements, and it might just be because of the composition of their diet. And I do think Paul Saladino is probably on the right track with his style of carnivore. Frank Tufano as well, obviously, but I don't really think he's a good source of information. But maybe a more balanced paleo diet, or primal blueprint style diet, or just a diet where you are consuming adequate amounts of DHA, EPA, and lower omega-6, and then maybe getting enough nutrients like folate, vitamin B1, and vitamin C from low glycemic load carbohydrates. In particular, fruits and tubers, okay? Because human beings never ate these fibrous leafy greens and broccoli. Really, the whole purpose of hunter-gatherers finding food was caloric energy. You really think that hunter-gatherers were like, oh, let's eat these leaves off the tree, and they feel like crap? There's no caloric energy in them. It's just fiber, makes them bloat up and fart. Chances are tubers, fruits, and meats, animal proteins, were the highest, like the best source. And that's why I have people who have irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, and they when they get put on this autoimmune paleo diet consisting of just fruits, maybe some tubers and some meat, all of their bloating and digestive symptoms go away. It's because human beings haven't been consuming broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and shit like that, for longer than 200 years. We just created these foods, hybridization to the extreme. But even wild fruits were pretty high in fructose content. So, this whole idea that we haven't been eating like fructose and whatnot for a long time, it's actually not true. But modern fruits are not the same as they used to be. And tubers were a huge part of the diet for a long time. So if you emphasize these ideas, and whether you're low carb, high carb, it doesn't matter. Low glycemic load, proper, fatty acid intake, you'll be good to go. So leave your questions in the comments down below, and I'll talk to you all in the next video. Thank you very much.